The world of the 1970s offered a unique, fleeting moment in the history of global travel. It was an era defined by a collective yearning for enlightenment, a rejection of post-war materialism, and the birth of what became known as the Hippie Trail. Thousands of young, idealistic travelers from Europe, the Americas, and Australia packed rucksacks and set out on an overland journey that typically wound through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, and into Southeast Asia. They traveled cheaply, relying on local buses, shared taxis, and the kindness of strangers. Communication with home was sparse, dependent entirely on the poste restante system, where letters were held at central post offices in major cities awaiting collection. In this pre-digital age, there were no mobile phones, no internet footprints, and no instant bank transfers. A traveler could easily drop off the map for months at a time, without causing immediate alarm among their families. This atmosphere of absolute freedom and profound trust created a vibrant global community of wanderers. However, this same environment of transient anonymity also provided the perfect hunting ground for one of the most calculating and methodical predators of the 20th century. To understand the complex investigation and the eventual forensic triumphs that brought an end to this crime spree, one must first examine the psychological profile and the meticulous methodology of the perpetrator. Born in French Indochina to a Vietnamese mother and an Indian father, the individual who would later become the subject of an unprecedented international manhunt grew up navigating fractured identities and a tumultuous upbringing in France. Psychological analysts who have studied the case often point to a classic presentation of the dark triad personality traits, encompassing narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. Unlike impulsive offenders, this individual operated with a chillingly calm transactional view of human life. He did not act out of uncontrollable rage. Instead, he viewed the young travelers on the Hippie Trail simply as resources to be harvested. They possessed passports, traveler's checks, and hard currency. To him, these idealistic youths were nothing more than a means to finance an opulent nomadic lifestyle. The modus operandi was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, operating primarily out of Bangkok, Thailand, under the guise of an affluent gem dealer named Alain Gauthier. The perpetrator and his accomplices would frequent the cafes and budget hostels popular with Western backpackers. He possessed a disarming charisma and an uncanny ability to identify the specific needs of a traveler. If a backpacker was looking for cheap accommodation, he offered a room in his apartment complex. If they were seeking adventure, he offered to take them to exclusive gem markets. The trap was sprung through the calculated administration of incapacitating substances. He would surreptitiously introduce powerful laxatives, sedatives, or antiemetics into their food or drink, simulating the symptoms of severe dysentery, a common affliction for travelers in the region. When the victims became violently ill, he would step in as the benevolent savior, offering them shelter and what he claimed was medicine. In reality, the medicine was a further cocktail of central nervous system depressants, designed to keep the victims in a state of compliant lethargy while he systematically drained their bank accounts, cashed their travelers' checks, and, most crucially, stole their passports. In the 1970s, passports were simple paper booklets with easily manipulated photographs. Border control relied entirely on the visual inspection of these documents by immigration officers. By carefully peeling back the laminate and replacing the victim's photograph with his own or those of his accomplices, the perpetrator created a seemingly endless supply of forged identities. He crossed international borders with impunity, literally traveling under the names of the people whose lives he had extinguished. When a victim was no longer useful, or when they began to realize the true nature of their illness, they were eliminated. The remains were often subjected to fire or water to obscure their identities and delay any potential homicide investigation, buying the perpetrator the time needed to cross another border. The catalyst for the unraveling of this extensive criminal enterprise did not come from a major international police force, but rather from the persistent, methodical inquiries of a junior Dutch diplomat stationed in Bangkok. In early 1976, Herman Knippenberg, a 31-year-old third secretary at the Netherlands Embassy, received a letter from a distressed family in Holland. Two Dutch citizens, Henk Bintanja and Cornelia Hemker, had ceased all communication. They were meticulous correspondents, and their sudden silence was highly uncharacteristic. Knippenberg was tasked with looking into their disappearance. In the grand scheme of embassy duties, tracking down missing backpackers was often viewed as a low priority, as young people frequently lost track of time or changed their itineraries. However, Knippenberg possessed an innate analytical rigor and a deep sense of duty toward his fellow citizens. He refused to dismiss the disappearance as a simple case of youthful irresponsibility. Knippenberg began a painstaking reconstruction of the Dutch couple's final known movements. His investigation revealed that they had met a wealthy French gem dealer in Hong Kong who had invited them to stay at his apartment at Canut House in Bangkok. Knippenberg approached the local authorities with this information, but he encountered significant bureaucratic inertia. The concept of a serial predator targeting foreign nationals was virtually unheard of in Thailand at the time, and the local police were severely under-resourced. Frustrated by the lack of official action, Knippenberg, assisted by his wife Angela, essentially initiated a parallel, civilian investigation. They transformed their diplomatic residence into a makeshift incident room, gathering intelligence, charting timelines, and quietly interviewing residents of the expatriate community. A critical breakthrough occurred when Knippenberg learned of two unidentified bodies that had been discovered weeks earlier. The remains had sustained fatal injuries and had been severely damaged by fire, rendering visual identification impossible. Initially, the local police believed the victims were a pair of missing Australian backpackers. Knippenberg, relying on his growing suspicion regarding the gem dealer at Canut House, suspected otherwise. He requested the dental records of the missing Dutch couple from the Netherlands. In an era long before the advent of rapid DNA profiling, forensic odontology was one of the few reliable methods for identifying severely compromised remains. Human dentition is unique to each individual, and the materials used in dental restorations, such as amalgam fillings, are highly resilient to extreme temperatures. When the dental charts arrived from Europe, Knippenberg coordinated with a forensic dentist in Bangkok to compare the antemortem records with the postmortem findings of the unidentified remains. The process was exacting and highly scientific. The forensic examiner analyzed the morphology of the teeth, the specific placement of the restorations, and the unique root structures. The conclusion was definitive and tragic. The dental records matched perfectly. The unidentified bodies were indeed those of Henk Bintanja and Cornelia Hemker. This undeniable forensic link transformed a missing persons inquiry into a double homicide investigation, providing Knippenberg with the leverage he needed to force the hand of the authorities. Armed with this forensic certainty, Knippenberg escalated his efforts. He cultivated a vital source of information within Canut House itself, a neighbor who had grown deeply suspicious of the constant flow of sick travelers entering the gem dealer's apartment and the strange, secretive behavior of the occupants. When the perpetrator and his primary accomplices briefly left the country, Knippenberg organized a clandestine search of the apartment. What he discovered inside was a chilling testament to the scale of the criminal enterprise. The apartment was a factory of fraud and deception. Knippenberg found a cache of stolen passports belonging to missing individuals from multiple nations. He discovered syringes and a vast array of industrial poisons and pharmaceuticals, perfectly matching the substances required to simulate dysentery and incapacitate victims. Furthermore, he found the personal diaries and belongings of several missing travelers, including those of the Dutch couple. Knippenberg meticulously documented, cataloged, and photographed every piece of evidence. He maintained a strict chain of custody, recognizing that these items would be crucial in any future legal proceedings. He compiled this mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence into a comprehensive dossier, which he distributed to international embassies and to Interpol. Knippenberg's dossier effectively dismantled the perpetrator's anonymity. The gem dealer was no longer a shadow, operating in the margins of the Hippie Trail. He was now the target of a coordinated international alert. However, capturing the suspect proved to be an incredibly complex challenge. Utilizing the stolen passports, the perpetrator had already fled Thailand, initiating a frantic cross-continental evasion. His flight took him through Malaysia, Switzerland, France, and eventually to the Indian subcontinent. In Nepal, he continued his predatory behavior, resulting in the tragic deaths of an American woman, Connie Bronzich, and a Canadian man, Laurent Carrière. The local Nepalese police found the victims, but the perpetrator had already used Carrière's passport to slip across the border into India. The turning point in the pursuit occurred in July of 1976, in New Delhi, India. The perpetrator, operating under an assumed identity, approached a large group of French engineering students staying at the Vikram Hotel. He introduced himself as a pharmaceutical representative and offered to provide them with preventative medicine for local waterborne diseases. His intention was to incapacitate the entire group simultaneously, steal their valuables, and vanish. However, in his arrogance, he made a critical miscalculation regarding the dosage and the onset time of the sedatives. He administered the pills to the students in the hotel lobby. Instead of feeling lethargic in their rooms, the students began to experience severe adverse reactions almost immediately while still in the public area. Some collapsed, while others realized they had been drugged. Panic erupted in the lobby. The students, vastly outnumbering the perpetrator, overpowered him before he could escape. They detained him and immediately summoned the Indian police. The subsequent investigation by the authorities in New Delhi revealed the true identity of the man they had in custody. He was found in possession of a staggering array of forged passports, stolen traveler's checks, and the tools of his illicit trade. The international alert generated by Herman Knippenberg had reached India, and the pieces of the puzzle rapidly fell into place. The legal proceedings in India focused on the attempted robbery and poisoning of the French students, as well as the prior fatal poisoning of a French tourist in New Delhi. The prosecution presented a robust case based on eyewitness testimony from the surviving students, the physical evidence recovered at the time of the arrest, and expert toxicological reports detailing the nature of the substances used. The court found the defendant guilty and sentenced him to 12 years in the maximum security Tihar jail. For many, this conviction seemed like the conclusion of the saga. However, the perpetrator's time in the Indian penal system merely highlighted his extraordinary capacity for manipulation. He utilized his illicitly acquired wealth, smuggled into the prison, to bribe guards and establish a comfortable lifestyle behind bars. He cultivated relationships with journalists and authors, attempting to control his own narrative and present himself as an anti-hero rather than a predatory killer. But beneath this facade of control, a very specific legal clock was ticking. The authorities in Thailand had issued an extradition request based on the murders committed in Bangkok, crimes that carried the death penalty under Thai law. However, the Thai statute of limitations for these offenses was 20 years. If the perpetrator completed his sentence in India and was released before 1996, he would be immediately extradited to Thailand to face a capital trial. In 1986, facing the impending expiration of his Indian sentence and the looming threat of Thai extradition, the perpetrator executed a highly calculated escape plan. He organized a lavish party for the prison guards, ostensibly to celebrate his upcoming birthday. He distributed sweets and fruits that he had meticulously laced with powerful sedatives. As the guards fell unconscious, he simply walked out of the maximum security facility. He remained at large in India for several weeks before being apprehended at a restaurant in the state of Goa. This escape was not a desperate bid for permanent freedom. Legal analysts and psychological profilers agree that it was a deliberate, strategic maneuver. By escaping and being recaptured, he committed a new offense under Indian law. He was subsequently tried for the escape, convicted, and his sentence was extended by an additional 10 years. This calculated extension achieved his ultimate goal. He remained incarcerated in India until 1997. By the time he was finally released from Tihar jail, the 20-year statute of limitations on the Thai arrest warrants had expired. He could no longer be prosecuted for the crimes discovered by Herman Knippenberg. He was deported to France, where he lived freely, frequently charging exorbitant fees for media interviews, seemingly having outwitted the international justice system. The final chapter of this sprawling legal drama, however, was yet to be written, and it would hinge entirely on the enduring power of forensic evidence and the unwavering dedication of those who sought justice. In September of 2003, the perpetrator made an inexplicable decision. He traveled to Kathmandu, Nepal. The exact reasons for this journey remain a subject of debate. Some theorize he believed his past crimes were forgotten, while others suggest his pathological narcissism compelled him to test the limits of his perceived invulnerability. Whatever the motivation, it was a fatal misjudgment. Nepal was the one jurisdiction where an active, unresolved murder investigation still existed against him, relating to the 1975 deaths of Connie Bronzich and Laurent Carrière. While wandering through a casino in Kathmandu, he was recognized by a journalist for a local Himalayan newspaper. The journalist immediately alerted the Nepalese police, who moved swiftly to apprehend him. However, arresting the suspect was only the first hurdle. The Nepalese prosecutors faced a monumental legal challenge. They had to build a murder case for crimes that had occurred 28 years prior. The original detectives had retired, witnesses had dispersed or passed away, and the physical crime scenes were long gone. The prosecution needed concrete, irrefutable evidence to place the suspect in Nepal at the time of the murders and to link him directly to the victims. The key to unlocking the prosecution's case lay thousands of miles away in the meticulously preserved archives of Herman Knippenberg. Though long retired from diplomatic service, Knippenberg had never discarded the vast dossier of evidence he had compiled in the 1970s. When he learned of the arrest in Nepal, Knippenberg immediately contacted the authorities and offered his complete cooperation. He transmitted copies of the original hotel registration cards, the forged passports, and the detailed timelines he had constructed decades earlier. The Nepalese court proceedings became a fascinating showcase of historical forensic analysis. The prosecution's case relied heavily on forensic document examination. They introduced the hotel registration cards from Kathmandu in 1975, signed under the aliases the perpetrator was known to have used. Forensic handwriting experts were called to the stand. They conducted rigorous comparative analyses, examining the unique characteristics, stroke patterns, and pressure points of the signatures on the old hotel registers against the known handwriting exemplars taken from the defendant upon his arrest in 2003. The science of handwriting analysis, when conducted by certified experts, is highly empirical. The experts concluded, with absolute certainty, that the signatures from 1975 and the contemporary writing samples belonged to the same individual. Furthermore, the prosecution utilized the circumstantial evidence provided by Knippenberg's files to establish a definitive pattern of behavior. They demonstrated how the defendant had used Laurent Carrière's passport to exit Nepal shortly after the murders, a fact corroborated by border control records preserved in the diplomatic dossier. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that the extended passage of time rendered a fair trial impossible. They vehemently contested the validity of the photocopied documents provided by Knippenberg. However, the sheer weight of the corroborating evidence, the consistency of the modus operandi, and the undeniable scientific findings of the handwriting experts proved insurmountable. In August of 2004, the Kathmandu District Court delivered its verdict. Based heavily on the archival evidence gathered by a persistent Dutch diplomat decades earlier, the defendant was found guilty of the murder of Connie Bronzich and sentenced to life imprisonment. Several years later, following further legal proceedings and the introduction of additional historical evidence, he was also formally convicted of the murder of Laurent Carrière, resulting in a second life sentence. The man who had evaded international justice for decades by exploiting the jurisdictional boundaries of multiple nations was finally held accountable in a court of law. The incarceration in Nepal lasted for nearly 2 decades. During this time, the defendant launched numerous appeals, challenging the jurisdiction of the court and the admissibility of the ancient evidence, but the Supreme Court of Nepal consistently upheld the convictions. The legal saga finally reached its conclusion in late 2022. Citing provisions in Nepalese law regarding the advanced age and deteriorating cardiac health of inmates, the Supreme Court ordered his release and immediate deportation back to France. He left Nepal not as a vindicated man, but as a convicted murderer whose sentence was commuted solely on humanitarian and medical grounds. The resolution of this case leaves a profound legacy in the annals of criminal investigation. It serves as a historical marker for the evolution of international law enforcement. The vulnerabilities exploited during the 1970s prompted significant changes in global travel security. The ease with which passports were forged and borders were crossed directly influenced the development of machine-readable travel documents, biometric passports, and the real-time, digitized information sharing networks, currently utilized by Interpol and border agencies worldwide. The era of the anonymous traveler slipping effortlessly between identities was effectively brought to an end, driven in part by the devastating crimes committed along the Hippie Trail. Moreover, the case stands as a testament to the indispensable value of methodical, unbiased investigation. The outcome was not secured by dramatic shootouts or high-speed pursuits, but by the quiet, unrelenting dedication of individuals like Herman and Angela Knippenberg. Their commitment to treating the missing travelers, not as statistics, but as human beings deserving of justice, ensured that the evidence was preserved. Their reliance on forensic science, from the matching of dental records in Bangkok to the handwriting analysis in Kathmandu, bridged a gap of almost 30 years, proving that the truth, when properly documented, does not degrade with time. Most importantly, the focus must remain on the individuals whose journeys were so brutally interrupted. The young men and women who traveled the overland routes of the 1970s were driven by a spirit of exploration, a desire to understand different cultures, and a fundamental belief in the goodness of humanity. They were students, artists, and dreamers whose potential was permanently extinguished by a predator who viewed their trust as a weakness to be exploited. Their legacy is not defined by the manner of their passing, but by the adventurous spirit that defined their lives. The comprehensive historical record of this investigation ensures that their names and the truth of what happened to them will never be erased. As we examine the intricacies of this decades-long pursuit, from the bustling markets of Bangkok to the high courts of the Himalayas, we are left to consider the delicate balance between freedom and security. The travelers of the 1970s embraced a world without borders and without digital tethers, finding joy in the unknown. Today, our movements are tracked, our identities are biometrically verified, and our communications are instantaneous. While these advancements have undeniably made global travel safer and made it exceedingly difficult for predators to operate in the shadows, one must ask, in our modern pursuit of absolute security and digital certainty, have we permanently lost the profound, trusting spirit of adventure that once defined the open road?